just tell you a little bit about me, and then I have a lesson, and there'll probably be time, maybe a minute or two, to ask questions if you have some. Anyway, my name is Jim Sloan. My whole name is James H. Sloan. I don't give out the middle one. But there's reasons for that, but I'm not going to go into that. But anyway, God took a nobody. And I'm not saying that just to seek your, oh, he's humble, because I'm not. My wife continually warns me, that I'm not quite as smart, I'm not quite as perfect as the doctors say that I am. That gets her upset. That gets her upset quicker than I don't know what for me to come. Well, one of them told me, he said, your brain is normal. That really shook her up. So anyway, I was born a long time ago. I told you about, if you were here last night, you heard how God called me to work with the deaf, but I grew up in a family, dysfunctional family, and that's often, we didn't know what that word was, and we just thought, it was quite normal, but my mom and dad divorced when I was probably 5 years old. So after the divorce, my mom and my older sister and younger brother moved back near my grandmother, which was a blessing. I've been through with other people a lot of divorces, and most of them do not turn out where they can say it was a blessing. If at any time you can't hear me, just smile, and I'll think you're agreeing. No. Raise your hand, and we'll go from there. But which was a blessing because my grandmother was a very godly lady, and she raised her kids to be faithful in church. There was never a question. And so when we moved near my grandmother said, there's the church, be in it, and we were. And I grew up in that church. It was an independent Baptist church, like I am still. I'm an independent Baptist, and if you want me to explain that, I'll be happy to on other time, not my time. But anyway, I grew up in that church, and our pastor was similar to Pastor Holcomb. The Pastor Holcomb is like my pastor in my home church now. He's both a preacher and a pastor. And you do not find that in every guy. They're either a great preacher, pow, 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 and they don't think about you as members of the church. So, or a pastor, and he just loves his people to death, but when he gets in the pulpit, it's, oh no. Okay, well, my clock has stopped. I grew up in that church. I was well indoctrinated before I ever went to college. And I've not changed my position doctrinally or otherwise very, very slightly since that time. So God was preparing me, but I had problems. And so when I was about 15 years old, an uncle of mine that I talked about being the shade tree mechanic last night, an uncle of mine said to my mom, you ought to let Jimmy, I was Jimmy growing up, and I heard, I'll take all you give me, until I couldn't stand it anymore. And so he said, you ought to let him come and live with me before he has a nervous breakdown. My mother remarried, and she married an older gentleman, and I don't think he's very old now, but back then he was in his 60s, she was in her probably early 30s, and we never bonded. He was a great man, he was a great Christian, loved the Lord, loved the church, loved us, provided for us, but we just never bonded. And so my uncle, his name was Uncle Pete, took me in, and his wife took me in for a year, and it saved me because I was on the verge of a nervous break at 15. Can you believe that? Yeah. Anyway, I survived that and moved back to my home, and that's where I was when God called me to work with the deaf. Now, I've been around deaf people all of my life, and so it was not an unusual thing for God to say, I want you to work with the deaf. Okay, I just said okay. And that's when I turned to my grandmother, and you heard that story last night. And I went to Tennessee Temple schools, and met the lady that was to be my teacher for 3 years. And it was late in '56 when my lady teacher came to me and she said, James, because then I started James because it was fancy, and now I'm in college, She says, James, there's no place for, quote, the black deaf. But that was not the term that she used, okay? This is in '56.
Yeah.
There's not a place for them to worship God. I think you ought to do something about it. And I said, yes, ma'am. And so I went to every black church in Chattanooga, Tennessee, finally found one that said, yeah, you can come and bring the deaf here. So I was already going to the deaf school in Cave Springs, Georgia. And so I would go to Georgia, Cave Springs, and on Sunday morning come back, and then on Sunday night I would go around this way and pick up the black deaf and bring them to church, and then go this way and bring them to church, and we would have a Bible study class. Then we went up into the black church where I interpreted, sometimes taught, because pastors were not very well trained back in those days, and some of their messages were fine, but I said, oh no. So I just began to preach my own sermon, and just finished. Now, don't you do that as an interpreter, that's not recommended at all. So we worked with them for 7 years. I added, when I got married in 1960, we added the deaf school in Talladega, Alabama, so we were traveling 300 miles every Sunday, but preaching to over 300 black deaf students. And we were allowed to give invitation. They forced us to take an offering, and that was a blessing, because sometimes the offering usually was less than $1, but I would use that to buy gas to get back home in my car. That's how good God was. And so we did that, and then we finally wound up in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I was staff pastor to the deaf. We had all of our services separate for the deaf, except first Sunday in the month we went up after the service for communion or the Lord's Supper, depending on if you're Yankee or Southern. And so We stayed there for 7 years, then we went to Jamaica for 3 years. I was in charge of a deaf school there and pastor of deaf church. My wife was a nurse and is a nurse, she was in charge of all of that in the kitchen. So we stayed there for 3 years. The government would not issue us or reissue us work permit. We moved back to Grand Rapids, where I was on the staff for special ministries, but it was focused mostly on the deaf. We did try to get a ministry to the blind started, but was not very successful on that. But then in 1982, we moved to a place called Wichita. Yeah, when I said to my wife, we're going to move to Wichita, she says, Tornado Alley. But, you know, but anyway, we came here, a pastor for a small deaf church, Zion Bible Baptist Church. It was resurrected and is still going now. But we had to close it down in 1990. There's a story behind that. And we had to change mission boards at that time as well. And we came over to a church, small church, over on Westview Avenue called Calvary Baptist Church. We had gotten to know Pastor Holcomb and Miss Virginia, and so we became members of that church. And later we asked them, "You're our sending church," in case you didn't know that. But we're happy to be here. We were here until 2001, maybe 2002. 2002 we moved to the Chattanooga, Tennessee area because of expenses here. And the expenses here based on the payment that people get at Boeing. And we just could not afford to live here, and so we moved to Chattanooga. In the Chattanooga area, we actually live in Georgia, one block in Georgia. And we go back and forth, Georgia, Tennessee, whichever one has the cheapest gas. We go there. So that's the story of our life up until now. And 93, I went to Romania for the first time with a missionary that the church here supported and sent them out. They're no longer doing anything, I guess, I don't know, but he asked me, he said, "Would you go preach a Bible conference there in Romania?" And back in 93, they got their independence in December of 1990, and or 89, 90, 89, I guess. So they were just brand new, and he was kind of bringing pastors and preachers and professors in from even from Central in Minnesota, Central Bible Seminary up there. And they would go for a couple of weeks, and they would bring all of these pastors in to teach and to train them, because they had been underground and did not have any, quote, formal training. And so he asked if I would go with him, and I said, yeah, if you'll let me find out about the deaf. That's been the focus of my ministry from the very start, deaf. And they said, no problem. And so while we were there, we met with an interpreter. And of course, sign language in every country is different. So I could not sign to her American sign. She could not sign to me Romanian signs. So we were going through an interpreter, you know. And in the process of time, and we probably stayed there 3 hours, in the process of time I asked the interpreter, I said, do you know if the deaf have any kind of Bible study class or church service of any kind here? And these were her words, and I know them word for word because it penetrated. She said, I have interpreted for the deaf here 33 years, and the deaf have never had a Bible study class or a church service of any kind. She was Orthodox, and she said, I begged my priest to come and teach the Bible to the deaf, and they refused. And when I was on my way back, as I was circling in Kansas City, getting ready to leave, I said, Lord, why am I back here? I said the deaf have everything that they want here. They, it's just there. They come when they want to. But I said they're, great need in Romania. It still bothers me. But Psalm 37 came to mind, and it just simply says, and I can't quote it now, but anyway, it says, trust in the Lord, no, what does it say? Now I'm going to find it and show you what I can't remember. I can remember it when I see it, 37, delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of your heart. And I said, Lord, I want to go back. And since then, I've been able to go to 22 different countries. As I said a while ago, God took a nobody. When I graduated from high school, they have those picture books, and you get all of your people to sign it. I probably had 4 or 5 people to sign it, and not a one of them signed most likely to succeed. God knew something that the rest of them and I could not even envision. And God saw what I could become and used that. And as I was coming to church this morning, I was thinking about that, and I thought, when Samuel anointed David, and he said, you're the next king, he wasn't ready to become king, was he? He had to go through God's school of training. But God saw what David could become. And that's the reason he said that David will do after my own heart. He will do my will. And he will show that generation what God can do. And so that was it. Now, I have picked one thing, and I want to talk about this. In Acts chapter 3, verses 1 through 9, we're not going to read the whole thing. You know the story, don't you? It says that Peter and John were on their way to the temple because it was the hour of prayer. And somebody with not a lot knowledge of people and people's behavior brought a handicapped man and laid him at the door of the temple because people that were coming were religious type people, and they would be more likely to give the alms to this guy. And I love to tell this story in the sign language. You can just really get into it. But as Peter and John come by, it says they fixed their eyes on this handicapped man, or disadvantaged now man. And he's thinking, ooh, they're going to give me money, maybe enough money that I don't have to sit here all day and I can just, hey, come get me and take me home, And then Peter says, we don't have any money. How do you think that man began to feel? If you don't have any money, just move along. Somebody else might be coming that has the money. That you're bothering people from coming. Just move along. Can you imagine him thinking that? I can. I have display booths set up at conferences and this kind of thing, and people come in front of my car, and they sit there and they talk about their relatives, they talk about the weather, and then I want to say, would you just kind of move out in front? People are coming by, and they're seeing you and not my. So I understand how he feels. And so Peter says, we don't have any money, but what we have, in the name of Jesus, stand up and walk. And he did. And so in verse 8 and 9 it says, and he stood up and walked and entered with them into the temple, walking and leaping and praising God. And all the people saw him walking and praising God. Why do you think that this guy was jumping around just shouting hallelujah, glory to God? Man, whoa, yeah, what? I say he thought, what better word? And I don't know the Greek for fantastic, but I know the sign for it. And in French it's this, so it's fantastic. Why was it fantastic? And it says in Acts 4:14, and beholding the man which was healed standing with them, they could say nothing against it. And this was when they pulled him up before the Sanhedrins, and they were questioning him about all of that. But then in Acts chapter 4 and verse 22, it says this, for the man was above 40 years old. How many of you, never mind, 40 years, on whom this miracle of healing was shown. Let me ask you a question, and I never ask dumb questions, and I want an answer. It's not to, okay, tell me the end. No. Do you believe in miracles today?
Yes.
Yeah. I've heard preachers say this, the greatest miracle today is when God looks down at a rotten old sinner and by grace saves that sinner and completely turns his life around, like Igor. No. Anyway, like his story was, God completely changes the person. That's, AA works on that. They have more failures than they have successes. Rehab places, only God can change the nature of a person that wants to do wrong, that's naturally to do wrong, and change that to where he becomes wanting to do what is right. So I wanted to talk to you about a miracle in my life in Albania. This is going to give you some kind of an idea on how missionaries work, okay? Because this is Romania. In Romans chapter 10 and verse 1, brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. And I did change the word of God, all right? And I signed this, brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the deaf is that they might be saved. Also in 1 Corinthians 15:34, wake to righteousness and sin not, for some have not the knowledge of God, and that certainly describes 95% of the deaf people living on this planet right now at this minute. I speak this to your shame. Back in 20 somewhere, I cannot remember the date, I got an email from, I thought, a man, and I just texted him just a few months ago, and he said, I didn't do it. Anyway, I got an email from somebody saying, have you ever been to Albania, Tirana, the capital? There's a deaf school there, and there's a lot of deaf people, adults around there. I've seen them signing. And he said, have you ever been there? And I said, no, I haven't. But I want to go. And so, you know, in Matthew chapter 7, you know those two verses, don't you? And it says, ask and it shall be given you, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you. I started knocking on that door to get God to let me get into Albania. I put it in my newsletters. I gave it in my report when I would go to churches and talk about it. I just said, just pray that God will open the door so that I can go to, well, as I said the other night, I hate those verses that say, wait upon the Lord. You know, when I'm on the highway, I drive in the left lane. And I get upset if I have to come under the middle lane to pass somebody that's in my lane. That's true. I mean, I do that, you know. So I read this verse, knock and it shall be open unto you. Knock. How do you knock? Well, that's a knock, isn't it? If you knock that way at our door at home, we won't hear you because we're deaf, you know, so forget that. So I said, all right, Lord, you did say how to knock. So I started banging on the door. You know, oh, my coffee don't. So I started banging on the door. I said, until you tell me to stop, you're making too much noise, I'm going to bang, and I'm going to bang. And I was telling people, well, my trips, I would say, I'm banging. You join me and bang on that door. You just bombard God with the request that I get into Albania. There's those verses that I was talking about. Delight thyself also in the Lord. Commit thy way. Trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass. God had a plan. And God's plan does not always agree with my plan. Mm-hmm. But I always find that his plan is best. I do. I've tried mine, and it doesn't work good. So God has a plan. In October of 2021, now for several years now, I have come to the Midwest in October. And I usually have not necessarily been for the mission conference here, but I always had a Sunday night or a Sunday morning when I would give my reports and so forth. Every year we do that. So in October 21, my wife was just beginning her stage of dementia. And I was beginning to cut my trips shorter and shorter and shorter. Sometimes when I come to Wichita first, and then I go to Ankeny for the Faith Mission Conference there, which I've had displays and workshops for about, 10 years or more. But in October of 2021, I went to Iowa first and then came down here because there's two deaf churches here that I preach in as well, one here in Wichita and another one in Hutchinson. And so I set that up to where I'm in Calvary either Sunday night or Sunday morning, and then I rotate all of the others and get it together. And so October the 24th, I was supposed to preach here. And sometime in the week before that, I got a call from a pastor in Union Grove, Kansas. Any of you know where that is? I knew. But this guy said, I remember you when I was a kid. Now that's bad, but I remember you when I was a kid in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And he said, we're starting our mission conference on the 27th. I would like for you to come and open our mission conference for me. And I thought, no, I'll be home back in, Chattanooga area on the 26th. I got to be back home. I made a mistake. A long time ago, I made an agreement with God. You ask some people, can you come and preach? Well, I'll pray about it. And so I said, God, let's don't do it that way. I'm an independent. And he said, all right, what you got in mind? And I said, if they ask me, then I will accept that as your will, and the answer will always be yes. If you want me to go, don't let them ask me. That was our agreement. So I started in on God. Now, God, that was an agreement, and we've done that, we've kept that, and it's been perfect, it's worked for us, but it can't do it this time. I got to get home. And he said, remember our agreement? And he said it over and over again and again, I finally said, okay. And so I called the pastor and I said, I'll be there to open your conference. Good deal. So I went there. Let me see what the next one is. God had a plan. Okay. So I got there. I'm not sure that they even have a traffic light. Okay. It's that kind of place. And I knew when I was arguing with God, I'm saying, there's only going to be 10 or 12 people there. Anybody can open that. I gave him all of those, and he just shook his head. No, we had an agreement. So I went and met with the pastor, and of course he's grown, he's got kids and everything else now, because, if he was a kid back when I was in Grand Rapids, everybody's dead. But and so I set my table up, and it's a small church, and there were 12 people there that night. And I set my table up right beside the door, because it's just not, the church itself was less than this room, okay? And so I got up and I gave my, presentation. In it, I mentioned that I was banging on the door to get into Albania, and finished the service. Let me go back now. Before, when I was setting up the display table, a man came in the door. And the pastor yelled, "What are you doing here tonight? You're not supposed to be here until tomorrow night." He said, "Well, I didn't have a service tonight, so I thought I'd come." And they said, we support him. He's one of our missionaries. I said, great, So when I finished preaching and I had emphasized that I was banging on the door, I was walking back to my table, and that missionary was standing beside my table, and I thought, okay, maybe he wants to ask questions or discuss death or something. And when I walked up to the desk, he said, "You want to go to Albania?" Well, yeah, you know, if we could work that out, it would be nice. He said, well, I know a friend of mine is a missionary in Albania. I'll call him, he's in the States. He dialed it because this is on a Wednesday night, so the missionary is probably in a church somewhere. So he left a message. 2 days later, the missionary from Albania called me. And he said, I understand you want to come to Albania. Yeah, that's an understatement, but yeah, that's it. He said, we talked for a few minutes, and he said, where do you live? And I said, I live right outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee. And he said, I'm coming through there tomorrow. Miracle? Why did that man choose to come that first night? Why didn't he just say, well, I don't have a meeting, I'll stay home and just kind of rest up and breathe, you know? And, no, God's, you know, I like Nehemiah. You read Nehemiah, and Nehemiah saw God's hand in every, God's hand moved this, God's hand did this. God was continually doing things. God was bringing together his plan. You know, he was working it out. And so the next day he came, we met at a restaurant, we talked and we talked and we talked. And so we set dates. Why aren't you moving? To get to Albania. And in April of 2022, I, along with 5 others of my team, landed in Tirana. You can see that where that is, Tirana, Albania. And it was amazing. God just did one amazing thing after another. This is part of my team. We landed in Tirana. The big guy there is the missionary in Saranda, which I'll show you that in a minute. It's Saranda. And so he picked us up at the airport. We went to our hotel, deposited our luggage, and walked out and walked around the corner. And there on a concrete slab was about 4 or 5 young ladies. And they had their Bible open, so we knew that, you know, something was going on. And of course, I had a deaf man with me, and so we're signing. All of us are signing. All of us work with the deaf, and so we're signing except for the missionary. And we're just signing away, and all of a sudden, one of those young ladies just squeals, deaf, deaf, you know. And so, of course, we as hearing walked over and talked to her. And she said that she was there with the interdenominational big meeting for the young people. She was going to be working with the deaf, but not as an interpreter in church, but otherwise. And so we talked about her, and for a few minutes she said, oh, you know, the deaf, you've been to the deaf school? And I said, no, we haven't. She said, well, it's right up the street here, about 30 minutes. And so we talked to them for a few minutes, and then the pastor said, or the missionary said, well, you want to go to the deaf school? You know, there are certain questions that you classify as dumb. Yes! And so within, well, we walked the distance, and it probably took us a little bit longer because some people walk slower than others. And we got to the school, we got their attention, we came in, and they were just overwhelmed with gladness that, you know, people would take notice of deaf in the school. They had one class of young kids, about maybe 9, 10, 11, 12. We went into that class. They demonstrated, you know, for us and all of that. They were lip reading and signing. So then the assistant director took us in his office and talked to us and gave us each a sign language book from Albania, and just so excited. And he said, "Do you know where the Deaf Association is?" No. "Oh, well, I'll give you the address." And so he wrote the address and gave it to our missionary friend. And early the next morning, we were at the Deaf Association. Now, it has, in certain countries, when I go to get that much information, it has even taken me a second trip to get that kind of an information. God was just working it all together. We stayed for several hours at the Deaf Association. They were just absolutely amazed. That's where we found out that there is absolutely no religious work among the deaf in Albania, nowhere. And they would just be so glad to work with us. Oh, it was just you know, until we tell them that they're sinners, they need to be saved by grace. They're great friends and everything. So then from there we went to, the missionary took us to Sarana, and I'll have to show you that on a different slide, but yeah, there it is. There's Saranda down here, there's Tirana up there. And so we went to, and we got to Saranda. Now this is the head of my story, okay? So anyway, we got there, and we got located in our place, and early the next morning, we went for breakfast. Go for breakfast. We're up on a hill, a mountain, 150 steps down, okay, to get breakfast. Now, when you go down in another country, sometime or another you gotta come back up. My team said to me, that meant I'd slap them. But they said, "We'll be glad to bring you your breakfast if you want." I almost hit them with my cane, but they found out that I could go down and up those steps quite all right. But on the way, we knew that there was a deaf man there because he had helped the pastor move furniture before. That was his job. And he knew that the deaf man was at a coffee shop quite regularly. Now, Albania, one thing famous for is their coffee cafes. They have more coffee cafes than any other country in Europe. That did not make me sad. So the pastor knew where this coffee shop was, and so we went, and as we're going, one of the members said, "There's a deaf man." So we started the surface signing, Later we found out that he's a deaf man. He's probably 40 years old, but his mom brings him to stand beside her where she sells her fruit, not fruit, but vegetables along, because people will feel sorry for her and buy her stuff. So we went on to the coffee shop. The coffee shop manager said, "Well, he was not in this morning, so he's probably working. I know where he lives. I'll go see." The manager of the coffee shop. He leaves his shop, and he's gone for at least 30 minutes, and he comes back and he said, "Well, he is working, but his wife said that he'll meet you here at 7 o'clock tonight." And that's when we met Dodi. And it just worked out. But there's more to this mystery. I went back in 2023 to train. Let me tell you this. One of the things that that missionaries have to do is they have to get people to give them money. It takes money. You know, for plane tickets now going to in Europe, it's almost double what it used to be 10 years ago. Food, all of this kinds of things. But it says here that God is able to make all grace abound towards you, that you always having all sufficiency in all things may abound to every good work. And so I set a goal. How much I find out how much our tickets are going to cost, and then I try to figure out how much our room and board and transportation. We do not depend on the missionary or the national pastor for anything. I mean, when we leave from there, they're better off financially than they were before we got there. I learned that when I was in Jamaica. In Kingston, people would call from the airport, "Oh, could you come and get us? We're here in beautiful Jamaica." I said, "No way. When I go into a foreign country, I make sure that we take care of all the expenses." And so I set up for this one, and we got the ticket. I got my ticket, and I was going by myself this time. I got my ticket, had it in hand. And then I start getting the money for the room and board, and I set that up for $1,500. And so I get, you know, I had 1,000, then 1,100, 1,200, and I'm lacking some money. Pastor said to me, "Why don't you preach on Sunday night?" And I was supposed to leave that next Friday, I think it was. And he said, "Just give them an update on your trip and then preach." And I said, "Okay, I'll do that." So I preached, and I mentioned the fact that, you know, I was short. I didn't say anything more. I just said, "We're a little bit short, so just pray that God will provide." That night, a very good friend of my pastor, who is a pastor in another church, they had their homecoming, and so they had a Sunday morning and Sunday afternoon, and so he came over to our church for Sunday night. When I finished, I went back to the sound booth to take care of all of this stuff, and he came back and he slapped somebody and said, "That's $93, and that's all the money that I have." Thank you, sir, very much. There was a family that was visiting that night. Visiting, because they were on their way to Pigeon Forge, and you know, that's a big vacation place. And so they had stopped at our church because they knew another family in our church. And as the husband walked out, you know, he shook hands with me, and I felt it. You know, missionaries like that feeling. And so I just put it in my pocket. I thanked him very much. So when I got home, I counted it all up. We had $1,443. And I said, "I'll miss a meal. That'll make it. I'll stretch it, and we can go." Because we have a rule. If we don't have the money, we don't go. And so God provided. When I got back home, I counted up my expenses. It was $1,448. $5 difference, and it was sufficient. God was it. I guess I'm supposed to stop at about 10:15 or 10:30. They start there at 10:30, so you well, no. I don't know if you can understand when I have done 22, or I've probably done 150 or more airplane flights. That's landing and taking off. When are most airplanes crashed? When they're landing and when they're taking off. So when we were coming, when I was in the plane by myself, of course, with all the other people, but when we were coming into Tirana to land, the plane was kind of, and some of that's natural, you get to know that kind of stuff. And so as we got closer to the runway, man, it began to rip. And I said in my heart, Lord, you're going to have to help this guy land this plane. And about that time, he revved the engines up and took off and circled around. And they explained later, of course, that there were crosswinds there, and they thought it best that he not land. Let me tell you, Peter's prayer principle works. You remember when he was sinking, he didn't say, God, you remember your promise in Psalm 37, you're take care of it. Oh man, he said, Lord, save me. That was it. And let me tell you, God answers that kind of prayer, all right? It's kind of like Nehemiah again. There he is, as he's standing before, he said, I prayed to God and answered the king. That meant that he, in chapter 1, he had already prayed up. And so he said, Lord, help me, boom, and he answered the question. And so, another miracle. This is the people that are there that I trained, and I need to get back there to do some follow-up on that. We know that all things work together for good. God put the whole thing together so that he would receive the glory. Here's the promise that when we go, if we give the seed, somebody's going to water it. God's going to give the increase in his time. And this is a picture of Dodie over here. This is the sign for promise, of course. And this is Dodie. The other family, I have a church in Florida that supports me. And they sent me this picture. This is a family that lives in the far regions of the Philippine Islands. They have 4 deaf kids, and they have no place to send the kids at all. And so if you were here last night, you know the story of Dodie and his need to be saved, but it's just that miracle. Man, I'll tell you, there were so many miracles on that trip that I just came home and I said, I've got to share that with people. And, God has done things like that over the years again and again and again. And he'll do that for you. Yeah, he'll do that for you if you're honestly seeking his will and doing it. All right? You got 5 minutes, so see, I hurried so that you would have time for questions. If you don't have a question, good deal. I'm good at what I do. Yes, sir.
Do you have any definite plans of getting back to Albania?
That is what I am waiting for. That missionary to send me a date to come back. I have done everything. I have bothered him again and again and again and I do not have any idea why he is not sending me. Now, let me tell you this. My co-worker, Matthew, went to Tirana because when I was there in 23, I went back to Tirana and talked to missionaries and pastors there and got them to want to have a deaf ministry there. So Matthew, because I was going to Ireland, Matthew went to Tirana, and God it was amazing the things that he got done in the 2 weeks that he was there. So There was a church there that was supposed to vote on whether they would start a deaf ministry. And so when they vote yes, of course they're going to vote yes. We've got to go back and then train people to do that. And so God's not finished with Albania, yes.
I had a question. I understood that you had someone helping you do video teaching.
Yeah.
How is that coming along, or is it still coming?
Technology. I was supposed to be in the Chattanooga area, and actually by some program, I was supposed to be there, but I could preach to them in that church in Wisconsin, and we could communicate back and forth, all right?
Mm-hmm.
When the time came for me to connect with them, now the pastor was not going to be there, that's the reason I was going to be preaching, but he said this woman would be there, and when you do that, you contact them, but then they have to welcome you in.
Oh, like a Zoom meeting?
And they could never welcome me in for some reason.
Huh.
I could get there and the dialogue box would say, you have to be welcomed, we're searching for welcome. We tried from 7:15 to a little bit after 8. Finally, through the telephone, she said to me, what do you think we should do? And I said, well, basically, why don't you just go ahead and have your prayer section part of it now and just go home. And I haven't heard from them, but I want to follow up on that because there's a lot of churches with deaf men as pastors, and if they leave, they have nothing. And so if I can set that up to where I can preach and teach, from that, then we can, it's going to be a good ministry, especially if I have to slow down. If I have to cut my trips shorter and this kind of thing, that will be a good alternative for me. And I also am trying to get a web page where I've got all kinds of materials that I have collected over 68 years of working with the deaf. And I want to get those on the computer so that it would help people. So there's some things in the working, but it's technology. And like I said before service to someone, I said, I learned technology when I need it. And this codes and things for the web page, I'm not just clear on that yet. And the gentleman that's helping me lives in Columbus, Georgia, which is about a 4 or 4.5 hour drive from my home. And so, it'll happen when God, I've learned a long time ago. Well, no, I haven't learned. But I do know that it's best to wait on God's plan, and when He plans it, He works it out. So we're planning to do that. All right? Let's have prayer, which we didn't start, did we? Oh my goodness, no wonder I rambled. Father, thank you for our class this morning. Thank you for these who are interested. I pray, Father, that the information that I gave is right and is correct, and it gives you the honor and the glory for all that's accomplished. Thank you for working in individual lives, and we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. If you were at my church, I would say, hurry and grab your seat, which is a joke, okay?